We're now going to talk about some of the most important women artists from the Renaissance. The first one I'm going to talk about is Sofonisba Anguissola. Some books on women artists actually begin with Sofonisba. And as you can see from this, we don't know her exact birth date. Some books have suggested 1532, but evidently her parents were married about that time. The birth dates have been as early as 1528, which is not very likely, and as late as 1535. They're probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1533 to 35 because she's the oldest child of parents who were married around 1532 to 33. Now, she's from Cremona, which is in northern Italy, and she's very, very unusual as a woman artist because she is from the aristocracy. And I think that her life situation has a lot to do with why she was able to become a very successful woman artist in the 16th century. Generally, of course, you'll see that most women artists have a father or someone who is an artist who trains them, especially at this early date. But with Sofonisba Anguissola, as I said, she's from the aristocracy. Now, they are fairly new. The family is fairly new to the aristocracy, the Anguissola family. Her grandfather was ennobled. And he only had one child, her father, and he was illegitimate. So they had to go through the legal process of making him legitimate. There's a process you can do so that he can inherit, and he can inherit the title. And then Sofonisba, her 5 sisters, and her brother, the next generation, are the first generations of this family to be born into the aristocracy. One of the fascinating things about it is that her father did have all 6 girls, Sofonisba, Elena, Lucia, whom we'll hear more about later, Minerva, Europa, and Anna Maria. Those were the girls' names. They had them all educated in Latin, music, and painting. And they didn't all become professional painters. Sofonisba becomes a professional painter. She lives a long life, very successful, as we'll hear. Her sister Elena is trained in painting. She enters a nunnery, a convent, and we don't know if she continued doing any artwork. We have no knowledge of that. Her sister Lucia is a painter, but she dies fairly young, in her 20s. And then her next sister, Minerva, although all of them do some painting, and we think that the older girls, probably Sofonisba, probably taught her younger sisters. Minerva does, some painting, but she's better with her Latin scholarly readings and writings. That's what she does a little more with. And the same thing with the 2 younger girls. There's a few things that have been attributed to them, but I know that Anna Maria gets married, so they don't really have a career as artists. So Sofonisba and Lucia, the oldest and the 3rd daughter, are the ones we're going to talk about as far as being artists. But it's remarkable that they had all 5 sisters educated. And it's remarkable that they included painting in this education. So I have some theories about this. A lot of people have theories about it. Let's take a look at one of Sofonisba's pictures. This is a portrait of Sofonisba, and we'll come back to this and talk about it in a little bit. It's a self-portrait. This is a portrait of, it's a little family portrait of 3 of the members of the family and the dog. In the center is her father, Almacare, the sister Minerva, remember it's the 4th sister, and the brother, Asdrubale. Now, we don't usually know the dates when the sisters were born, but we do know the date when the male heir was born, Asdrubale, and that was in 1551. So just by looking at portraits of him, it gives us a fairly good idea of the approximate date of the painting. You know, if he looks a certain age, then within a certain range, that gives us an idea. So this painting is dated about 1557 or 58 because of you can see the age that Almakari, maybe looks about 6 or 7. Now, imagine this. You are from a noble family in Italy. You want to have a son and an heir. But you have 6 daughters born. You don't know if you're ever going to have a son and an heir. There are a couple of ideas about why he may have educated his daughters. Now, I think that it ties into the current ideas, the 16th century ideas, about aristocratic conduct in education. The most famous book on how to be a courtier is Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, which the first edition came out in 1528, and it had multiple editions all over Europe. The second book, it's divided into 3 books. I know they say the Book of the Courtier. You might think those really long chapters or something. But the second book of the Courtier is about, well, they can't call her the courtieress because in Italian that word comes out as courtesan. So he calls her the lady of the palace. In other words, the female courtier, and her behavior. And it's a fascinating dialogue because what he is doing is writing this as a dialogue. He's got 2 characters. I mean, there's more than 2 characters, but there's 2 major characters in this book who are actual people. Gaspare has the most horrible, disparaging, nasty view of women. You know, going back to Aristotle, they're somewhat like, he doesn't use the word mutant, of course, but, men that did not form properly, women are inferior beings, not capable of much of anything. And then Il Magnifico, and this is Giuliano il Magnifico, Giuliano de Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and he speaks in favor of women. And he even goes so far as to say that sometimes women are morally superior to men, which is about the first time I've ever heard that in history. You do hear it later, the 19th century, but fascinating. And he actually has a little line where he says that the female lady of the palace, the courtier, female courtier, should have the same skills, that she should be able to do the same things as the courtier, and does mention in just a one-liner painting. Now, or implies it anyway. In the Book of the Courtier, talking about the male courtier, he says a male courtier should know painting. So this kind of thing suggests that painting has now gone from being a manual labor to something that is an intellectual activity. The Renaissance phrase was ut pictura poesis, as poetry, so painting. And this, of course, is something that happens during the Renaissance, where the whole status of the arts becomes, I want to say, ennobled. I guess that's not a bad word. There are, of course, other ideas, and there were people in the 15th century who were educating their daughters as well. Several of the noble families of Europe would have their daughters educated. The Gonzaga family in Mantua, in the late 15th century, one of the daughters, Caterina, her tutor writes that she's mastered Latin and he now needs to get her a Greek book to teach her Greek. She's 6 years old. So when she's 7, she's going to start learning Greek. She's outstanding. There's no doubt about it. The d'Este girls from Ferrara are very well known. And the Sforza girls from Milan also have a classical education. Now, we don't know if any of them were doing painting. Supposedly, the Gonzaga family might have been doing some. There's some indication that was part of the education. But most of this is classical learning. So it's the idea of learning Latin. And so there are a number of noble women, a small number, but a number, who were famed for their learning. And there were a few non-noble women, for example, the daughter of a humanist, and they had a few more problems because there was this idea that if a woman were, say, to speak in public, giving, say, a Latin discourse or something, that she must be a profligate woman sexually. This didn't. The noble families usually were able to protect their daughters from that kind of thing. But if you were, say, a middle-class girl who got learning, which would be very, very, very unusual, if your father was a humanist, for example, there might have been some other difficulties. We're not going to go into all of that. But this idea of adding painting to the noble accomplishments is really, really unusual. And I think it has to do with this idea that, painting has become much more respectable. It's said that it is a noble accomplishment in Castiglione. I mean, what could be a better authority? Now, I think that one of the reasons that Al-Makari had his daughters educated was because this would enhance the nobility and the honor of the family. If you have fairly recently been named noble, there might be the idea that, yes, you want to prove that you really are. Now, he married into, the finest family in Cremona, so no problem with that way. But, it's like to really prove that you are so worthy, that you indeed are noble. He has his girls educated for the honor of the family. I think that's one of the reasons. Another idea that's been suggested, and I think that these are not mutually exclusive, I think these are two motivations that are going on, is, oh my goodness, says Dad, I've got to provide 6 dowries. Dowries for nobility could be very expensive. And, you didn't really have any choices. You had to provide dowries for your daughters. Even if they went into a nunnery, to a convent, you still had to provide a dowry to the convent. It might be that the convent would accept less than the husband who's trying to enhance his economic status with a really great dowry. But still, you had to come up with your 6 dowries, unless the daughter died before she was married. And of course, they didn't hope for that, and it happens sometimes. But that's not part of your strategy. So it may be that he had his daughters educated because he felt that in the nobility, accomplished women would be more marriageable. Say how accomplished we are, how noble we are. Also, and if worse comes to worse, it's possible that they could have a career to support themselves and to help the family. Now, when people suggest this, I think that's a little bit of hindsight, because really there weren't examples of a woman who had a career, a respectable career, as a painter. Properzia di Rozzi, but she's definitely not from the nobility. So this is actually what happened with Sofonisba. And her father actively made contacts to promote his daughter's career and to promote their fame. I mean, he wrote to important people, including Michelangelo, and sent examples. Vasari came to visit them, as we'll see. In fact, that's why we know about them for the first time, is because Vasari writes in his Lives of the Painters about the accomplished Anguissola girls, and that's in the 2nd edition of the Lives of the Artists. Here. So let's go and see what she did. Now, one of the things you have to keep in mind that during the Renaissance, the study of the nude and the study of anatomy became very, very, very important to be known as an excellent artist. If you didn't know anatomy, you were going to be bypassed. By this time, we've had people like, of course, Leonardo and Michelangelo who went so far as to dissect bodies. Now, that's unusual, but studied from the nude model is the way most of the artists would have learned their anatomy. Women are not allowed to do that. That would be the most shameful thing. It would have ruined a woman's reputation to do that. So, what can the woman artist do? Well, she's not going to be able to do nude classical figures, but what Sofonisba does is she specializes in portraits. She also does some religious work, as we'll see, but most of her oeuvre, the body of her work, is portraiture, because it's perfectly all right for a woman to look at people clothed, and especially to pay attention to the details of the clothing, which would be so important for aristocratic portraiture. Okay, how was she trained? Now, this is unusual too. Notice at this time, if you're going to be an artist, and we're talking male artists here, if you're going to be an artist, somewhere around 14 years old, probably varies from place to place, you are apprenticed to another painter, another artist. And depending on what the rules are at the guild and the town that you're living in, you have a certain number of years. For example, like maybe 4 years that you must be an apprentice before you could become a journeyman. Some people stay apprentices their whole lives, not that they aren't learning, it's just they don't have the money for the fees to set up as a master. But it's not possible for a woman to be an apprentice to anyone but her father or maybe some other family member, where she could have her own room in the house. Think about that. If you have a bunch of teenage boys and they, you're the master painter and you have, how much is a bunch? Let's say you have 4 apprentices and they're teenage boys. Where do they sleep? They don't have big houses. They don't have single bedrooms for everybody. They're going to either bed down in the studio or in the garret and dormitory style. What are you going to do with a woman, a young lady who is the apprentice? Can she bed down with the boys? Even if she doesn't, even if they find some nook or cranny for her, her reputation would be ruined because she would be associating with them. So this doesn't happen. There's no examples of this. But it gives you the idea that a woman cannot be apprenticed to be a painter unless, for example, as I say, is her father. So it's, in her household, and presumably she has her own room. Or all the daughters of the house have their own room or something like that. So what Sofonisba and her sister Elena do, it's very, very interesting. They take lessons. Now, this is really unusual. It's actually some decades later that the Courtiers family starts a school for artists in Bologna and changes the idea of art from being the manual labor that you learn as an apprentice to, hey, it's something you learn in an academy, in a school, and becomes sort of the ancestor of all of you who are studio art majors, or any of the people who take a studio art major in college today. So in a sense, Sofonisba is sort of that intellectual ancestor of all the people who could take art in college today, because she's taking it not actually in an academy, of course, but as lessons. And she and her sister, Elena, would go to the home of Bernardino Campi, who was one of the leading painters in Cremona. And I'm sure they would take their governess, their chaperone. In fact, the woman, I'm guessing, of course, but the woman who probably was the chaperone, we're going to see in some of the pictures, And she would be welcomed, they would both be welcomed by the wife of the artist, who would stay on premises while they're having their lessons. So, everything's very properly chaperoned. There's no chance that anyone could say, they were alone with this painter. Later on, Sofonisba trains with another artist, Bernardino Gatti, who has a style that's something like Correggio. So you see, I wrote down there, Correggiesque. Correggio has a very soft style with it's very soft edged, and the shadows and the lights almost sort of melt together, and filled with light, and sometimes very dramatic lighting. We'll see some of this in the works. So she's trained, she starts painting, she does drawings, she does paintings, and her father, as we said, actively promotes her career. He sends drawings to people, as we'll hear about the one that gets sent to Michelangelo, and it builds up her reputation. Now, she's two things. She's a noble woman, and she's also a trained painter.